Und jetzt wollen wir noch uns anschauen und dazu nochmal bitte die Slides, die ihr schon mal zeigen wolltet, ein, zwei Slides als Einführung für meinen nächsten Gast. Der Peter Sloterdijk hat mal, also Sie merken schon an den Pünktchen, der Satz war eigentlich viel länger, aber das ist halt bei Sloterdijk so. Aber in der Quintessenz kann man sagen, das Leitbild der Welt, die wir bewohnen, ist nicht länger die Kugel, sondern der Schaum. Das ist seine Resonanz auf die Diskussion über die vernetzte Welt, das Netzwerk. Seine Behauptung ist relativ schlicht. Er sagt, das Netzwerk ist nichts, was man in der realen Welt wirklich verwenden kann, weil der Schaum ist das Bild von Räumen, die zueinander stehen. Und wenn man eins weiterklickt, dann kann man ein bisschen Schaum sehen und auch seine Idee dazu, bitte nochmal eins weiter, damit umzugehen, nämlich dass dieses Denken im Schaum eben das Navigieren in labilen Strömungen ist. Also das Umgehen mit dem Labilen, das darauf reagieren, das Navigieren da drinnen, der Begriff des Navigierens ist auch einer, der immer populärer wird, wenn es um das alte Steuern von Unternehmen geht, also weg von dem Steuern und das Steuer in der Hand zu haben, hin zum Navigieren, sich zum Orientieren, sich zurechtfinden im Raum der Gegenwart. Und wir hatten vor 2 Jahren ja auch die Freude, Dirk Becker bei uns zu haben. Bitte das nächste Chart noch, den ich unlängst getroffen habe und wo er gesagt hat, Vernunft, das ist der Inbegriff der Moderne. Sie können mal versuchen, mit unserer Welt heute vernünftig umzugehen. Völlig ausgeschlossen ist seine Meinung. Also völlig ausgeschlossen, den Zugang nur über die Vernunft zu finden, völlig ausgeschlossen, die Welt rein als Kugel zu betrachten, sondern in den labilen, in den Gefügen, in der neuen Art des Navigierens. Und um das neue Navigieren zu lernen, brauchen wir eben auch vielleicht mal ein paar Blicke in Organisationen, in die wir üblicherweise nicht so blicken, wenn wir über unsere Form der Organisationen nachdenken. Damit dieser Blick gelingt, haben wir jemanden eingeladen, der sich damit intensiv beschäftigt hat. Alexa Clay ist eine amerikanische Autorin, die sich mit Misfits auseinandergesetzt hat und uns einen Einblick geben kann, wie Organisationen funktionieren, die eben nicht nach den klassischen unternehmerischen Prinzipien aufgestellt sind. Ich freue mich sehr, Sie hier bei uns auf der Bühne zu haben. The stage is yours. Now we switch to English. Alexa Clay.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Cool. Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you for having me. I want to share a little bit about my research for the past 3 years talking to misfits, so speaking to pirates, hackers, and gangsters, and really talking to people on the fringes in the black market economy, in the informal economies, and in the gray market economies. But before I jump in, I wanted to share a little bit about my own background, my own experiences, which very much inform this research. So growing up, both my parents were anthropologists. My father did work with indigenous people in the Amazon, building some of the first fair trade supply chains. And this was really unpopular at the time because a lot of people within the anthropological community were more interested in indigenous preservation than livelihood generation. So he was a little bit of a black sheep or a misfit, trying to really integrate marginalized communities into the economy. And meanwhile, my mother traveled around the world talking to people who'd been abducted by aliens, by UFOs. So I don't know how many people believe in aliens. We can maybe talk about that over drinks. But for me, this was terrifying. Between the ages of 8 and 14, I had all this fear that I would be abducted by aliens. And then as I became more of an adolescent, more of a teenager, I began to feel a little bit jealous that, why wasn't I being chosen as this ambassador of the human race to connect with these aliens? But this very strange upbringing, this childhood of mine, really gave me appreciation for speaking to people that make us uncomfortable. I think we're so often in our own echo chambers, surrounded by our own peers and social networks. And there's a real power in connecting to people from very different worlds. I think, the aliens growing up with this present reality was about thinking outside of Western consciousness, beginning to question some of the assumptions that we bring to life, and really having to be a bit more open-minded. So my first test in open-mindedness was actually about venturing into the corporate trenches, this corporate heart of darkness. I tried to bring all my anthropological perspective to corporations and to big institutions and to multinational companies. And within this industry, I felt like I discovered what is a lost tribe within these institutions. You can call them intrapreneurs or culture hackers, but very much these insider misfits, these rebels, these people that are trying to get cultures within organizations to adapt, to evolve. They're very much bridges into the future. And so one individual that I met really early on in this research, around 7 years ago, was Dave Burdish, who was a third-generation auto worker for Ford Motor Company. His great-grandfather was someone who'd worked for Ford as well, who'd been beaten on the assembly lines. And so he had this thing he inherited, which was this love-hate relationship for his company. He was very much a loyalist. He didn't like anyone to say anything bad about the company, but at the same time, he was trying to get the company to do better on human rights, to think about business models beyond just making more cars, but what would it be like to get involved in mobility solutions, in urban transport solutions. And he was someone who really never got promoted because he was always working on these skunk works projects. He was always working on these really disruptive kinds of ventures. And so he didn't follow the traditional path within an organization, but he got the ear of the CEO, he had protection from leadership, and he was really a misfit trying to navigate the organization. And so meeting more and more people like this, I started putting together a network for insider misfits, for people that were trying to hack the cultures of these huge multinational Fortune 500 companies. And what we started doing was just bringing people together very simply in circles. It was a little bit based on the model of Alcoholics Anonymous, where you come together and you say, yes, I'm a misfit, and then you share your story. And the biggest learning here was there's a sweep of challenges. If you're an insider misfit, you can't just be a protester who can express everything they think and feel. If you're working within a large institution, you have to know how to camouflage your agenda. You have to know how to navigate the politics of the organization. It's a little bit like Game of Thrones plotting. There was someone I interviewed who said they spent more than 70% of their time thinking about the psychology, the decision-making of other people. So you really have to know how to make the business case, and you have to know how change happens within your organization. And so bringing people together was really this opportunity for emotional support, for peer-to-peer therapy, to really begin strategizing. And so we would have people from telecom companies supporting people from energy companies and really thinking about what is possible, because the corporate environments weren't enabling these individuals. We talked about it as a sort of clay layer of middle management in which you had senior leaders that were often very supportive of some of these more disruptive approaches, and then you had a bottom layer of sort of younger talent incredibly excited about what was possible, and then you had middle management that was very hard to navigate. And so this really became a grassroots movement, a guerrilla movement within the corporate sector to upskill people around these skills for harnessing more deviance and change-making at work. And then thinking about this more, it really became interesting to me to think about, well, who are the people who are the misfits not inside these institutions, but the misfits on the outside? Who are the people from the fringes that we can learn from? The hackers, the pirates, the gangsters. And so I started doing this research, and it was a lot harder because there's no LinkedIn for like the black market economy. And so it took so much time. It took us 3 years to contact Somali pirates, and then eventually we had all these Skype calls with Somali pirates that had been put in prison. And so I want to share a few of these stories and some of these protagonists. But really, the wow insight for this was to really understand that actually the black market economy is part of capitalism, and it's always been part of capitalism. So if we think about things like the franchising model that we associate with companies like McDonald's today, it actually didn't start within the traditional formal business community. Franchising was a tool that groups like the mafia, groups like Hell's Angels, that gangs were using long before it was co-opted by the corporate sector. Similarly, you have video streaming technology that's really disrupted a lot of industries today that you see with Netflix, with Amazon, with Hulu. A lot of these video streaming technologies were used in the porn sector. We're really being pioneered there. And so I think often looking at some of these trends, we have to pay attention to what's happening in the black market economy, what's happening in the gray market economy. Now there are a lot of media distributors that are watching and seeing where people are pirating content and which television shows are popular. And they're using this to assess their lineup. They're using this to choose where they should invest money in. And so you have these parallel shadow markets that are very much informing mainstream business. And here's a video where you can see some of the protagonists that we spoke to.
Lawbreakers. One law made, 100 laws made to break it.
Great. So there you can see some of the different types of people that we really interviewed for the book. And from there we harvested what are the key recipes, what are the key lessons that we can learn from these misfits that we can apply to formal markets, that we can apply in our everyday work lives. And so the first one we highlighted was really around this idea of hustle. Entrepreneurial hustle is something that you see across the black markets, in the street corners, in urban slums. This idea that really a lot of entrepreneurial creativity comes from this environment of extreme constraint, of frugality, and that's really important. And so we looked at a lot of parallels between the kind of street corner entrepreneurs, the hawkers, the gang leaders, and showing some connections between that hustle and the hustle you see within Silicon Valley. Next, we looked at this idea of hacking, which wasn't just computer hackers, but really looking at this principle of people that were trying to hack culture, that were really trying to transform the basic DNA of different communities. And I think we're all born into these cultures that we didn't help create. that we didn't have any decisions in shaping. And so many of the misfits that I spoke to were really interested in this idea of active culture shaping, of creating alternative cultures. So I'll share a little bit from here. And then looking at this idea of copycats. We're seeing the rise so much of new power culture around open source, around the freedom of information. And so I want to share a little bit about new business models that are being developed that have less respect for intellectual property and some of the power that we're seeing with pirate communities. And then looking at this idea of provocation. I think so often, we can think of having this engineered plan, but what intrigued me about a lot of misfits, particularly activists or, people that were performing more provoking comedians or agitators, was really around this delicate spirit of questioning myths. And you even see this in organizations today. There's a role for the troll, the person who's constantly kind of the cynic, or the person who's constantly questioning the sacred cows of the organization. And then lastly, looking at this idea of pivoting. And so not just pivoting our organizations, but taking these enormous leaps of faiths ourselves. How do we give ourselves permission to live more authentically, to listen to our own inner misfits, and to be able to take jumps? And everyone we interviewed was enormously successful at being able to have the courage to jump or apply a discipline from another way of life or another community. And so we'll share quickly about some of those. But the real message behind the book is, let's get away from this portrait of the entrepreneur as the Silicon Valley innovator. If you're a drug dealer, then you know how to do many entrepreneurial things. You know how to grow a brand. You know how to recruit customers. Maybe you're not as good as at risk management because you often wind up in prison, but you have all these incredible entrepreneurial skills. There's a woman I met who started doing volunteering in prison communities, and she came from the world of venture capital and private equity. And she was blown away by the entrepreneurs that she encountered within prisons, and so started creating an incubator and started running business plan competitions. So when ex-cons were out, they could recognize that they developed all these skills, all these assets in the black market economy that they could then apply to formal markets. And so she's someone who's actively creating those bridges. Looking at hacker culture, we heard a lot about holacracy earlier, and I think this whole idea of reinventing organizations around new forms of power is very interesting. This is something that hackers do extremely well. They live in a world without bosses. And so how do we think about new kinds of egalitarianism, getting outside of command and control systems? With hacker groups like Anonymous, where anyone can claim allegiance to this community. It has really porous boundaries where there aren't bosses. And so inspired by this, really, I came to see historic pirate cultures as actually having a lot of elements, maybe not all of them of holacracy, but certain forms of egalitarianism. Pirates were some of the first to create constitutions, democratic constitutions, before European countries created them. And so really bringing this underdog spirit to reimagine how we cultivate our organizations today. And then looking at the power of copycats. The whole history of the US's industrialization depends on these patent robbers who stole patents from Western European companies and brought them to the US entirely illegally and commercialized them without respecting intellectual property. And so now it's a bit ironic when you see people in Brazil and India and China who are also not respecting patents, but it's actually really a pathway for development. And how do we put less of a premium on originality and create more space for piracy, for borrowing and stealing, for allowing for the diffusion of innovation? And there are really interesting ways in which companies are approaching this now, where they're developing more pooled approaches to R&D, or they're really not developing business models that are rooted in intellectual property ownership. There's one great patent robber I interviewed out of India who took Western pharmaceutical drugs and reverse engineered them and created these drugs much more affordably and accessibly for the poor, totally illegal. But as a result of his actions, the pharmaceutical companies had to develop new strategies for existing in emerging markets. They had to develop more affordable drugs to compete with the generics and the illegals that were flooding the marketplace. And so often as we might think of some of these actors as deviant, in many ways it's this catch me if you can situation that these deviant actors are actually allowing our formal markets to evolve. They're putting competitive pressure on formal companies to evolve. The last example that I really want to talk about is the power of provocation. And I think one really interesting element about provocation is this art of salesmanship. How do we enroll people into different possibilities of the future? And who's really good at that? Within the con man economy, you see this all the time. You see these confidence men who are pitching these totally bogus things and getting people to fall for it. There was a famous con man who was successfully able to sell the Eiffel Tower for scrap metal and run off with all the money in the early 1900s. There was another con man who I read about, Gregor McGregor, which sounds like a totally fake name, from Scotland, who invented this entirely fictitious country and recruited over 200 settlers to that country and raised all this capital. And the reason he was able to do that was because he created a fake natural history. He made a currency. He developed songs from the country. And so he enrolled people in this entirely different reality. And I'm not going to be able to share too much about the wonders of Misfit subculture related to live action role playing, but I'm a big fan of alter egos, as you'll experience later this afternoon. And so the last thing that I'll say is we should really be exploring LARP, for those of you who don't know. It's not just a medium for nerds running around the woods with swords, but it's really the power of being able to pop up these temporary realities. If we want to know what the future of finance looks like, let's create an extended live-action role-playing game around it. Let's begin to embody and feel into some of these cultures. So this is very much just a little taster of some of the different Misfit subcultures that I want to share with you. But later you'll see some of the power of thinking about alter egos and the ways that we can create bridges and gain insights from fringe cultures and bring them into our everyday businesses. Thanks.